1 second, screaming tires on a Seoul highway. Next second, face down in dirt that smells like no human has touched it in 10,000 years. A blue rectangle floats in front of his nose. Welcome to the procurement system. Balance, 500 points. 5 spears are already aimed at his chest. The budget, as always, is smaller than the need. Hyun-soo peels his face off the ground. Grass everywhere. Tall, dry, golden, stretching to a mountain range that looks like broken teeth on the horizon. No roads, no buildings, no power lines. Just wind and the cry of something that is definitely not a bird he ever heard in Seoul. His office shirt is torn at the shoulder. His slacks are caked in mud. His leather shoes are already soaked through. The blue rectangle hangs 30 centimeters from his face. He waves his hand through it. Fingers pass through like it's made of light. He taps it. A catalog opens. Food, tools, medicine, seeds, weapons, knowledge. Dried meat pack, 30 points. Flint knife, 20. Fire starter torch, 15. Bag of wheat seeds, 500. Antibiotics, 2,000. He closes the catalog. 500 points. His entire budget. 12 years of procurement taught him one iron rule. The budget is always smaller than the need. Always. He stands up. Something moves in the tall grass to his left. Then to his right. 5 figures step out of the brush like ghosts made of leather and bone. Matted hair past their shoulders. Skin darkened by sun, scarred by life. Crude loincloths of animal hide. And in their hands, obsidian-tipped spears aim straight at his chest. The tallest one barks something guttural, a language Hyun-soo doesn't understand. But the spear tips say everything. He raises his hands slowly. The tall warrior steps closer. Gaunt face, cheekbones jutting out like ridges on a cliff. Sunken eyes ringed with dark circles. This is not a healthy man. This is a starving man holding a weapon. Behind the warriors, more figures in the distance. Women carrying bundles. Children clinging to legs. An old woman hunched over a walking stick. All of them thin. All of them watching. The warrior grabs Hyun-soo by the collar, drags him forward. Hyun-soo stumbles, falls. A kick scatters dirt into his face. Another warrior wrenches his arm behind his back. Pain shoots through his shoulder. They're going to kill him. He sees it in their eyes. A stranger in strange clothes, appearing from nowhere on their territory. Threat or sacrifice? Maybe both. The tall warrior raises his spear. Hyun-soo opens the system. His eyes flick to the catalog only he can see. Fire starter torch, 15 points. He selects it. Warm light erupts in his right hand. A torch materializes from nothing. Solid wood, treated cloth, a flame already burning at its tip. Bright, steady, impossible. The warrior freezes. His spear hangs in the air. His mouth falls open. Every pair of eyes locks onto the fire that appeared from empty air. Hyun-soo holds the torch high. The flame dances in the wind. The warrior takes a step back. Then another. His spear lowers. His knees bend. He drops face first into the dirt, arms spread wide. One by one, the others follow. The women in the distance sink to their knees. Children hide behind their mothers. The old woman presses her forehead to the earth. Silence. Only the crackle of the torch and the wind through the grass. Hyun-soo stands there, holding fire in a world that hasn't learned to make it on command. His heart hammers, his legs tremble, but his mind is already calculating. That torch cost 15 points. He has 485 left, and these people are starving, every rib visible, every cheek hollow. He opens the catalog again. Dried meat pack, 30 points. He selects it. A sealed package of jerky appears in his left hand. He tears it open, holds it out toward the warrior still pressed to the ground. The smell of cured meat hits the air. The warrior lifts his head. Nostrils flare. Eyes go wide. Hyun-soo places the meat on the ground and steps back. The warrior reaches for it with trembling fingers, brings a strip to his mouth, bites down. His eyes close. He chews slowly, then faster. He turns and shouts something to the others. The word spreads through the group like fire through dry brush. More hands reach out. Hyun-soo opens another pack, then another. 30 points each. 455. 425. 395. 4 packs of jerky. 120 points spent. Balance 365. He bought himself maybe a day of goodwill. Maybe 2. These people need food not for today, but for every day after. And 365 points won't feed them for a week. The tall warrior rises. Meat juice glistens on his chin. He presses both fists to his chest and bows deep, then points toward a distant cluster of makeshift shelters. An invitation, or a command from a man who now believes he stands before a god. Hyun-soo picks up the torch and walks. The blue window pulses gently at the edge of his vision. Balance, 365 points. He feels the weight of it already. Not the torch, not the empty packaging scattered in the grass. The weight of being the only person in this entire world who can open a catalog and buy tomorrow. And the certainty that 365 points is nowhere near enough. The camp was worse than he expected. A dozen shelters made of sticks and animal hides leaning against each other like exhausted soldiers. No walls, no perimeter, no fire pit with coals kept alive overnight. Just a clearing in the grass where people slept on the bare ground and hoped nothing found them before morning. Hyun-soo counted heads as they walked him through the camp. 43 people. Maybe 44 if the bundle in the old woman's arms was a living child and not just rags. Of those 43, roughly 15 were able-bodied adults. The rest were children or elderly or sick. 3 figures lay motionless under a hide stretched between 2 sticks. He could hear the wet, rattling sound of labored breathing from 10 paces away. The tall warrior who had nearly killed him walked ahead with the confidence of a man in charge. He stopped in the center of the camp and turned to face Hyun-soo. He thumped his chest twice and spoke a single word. Darok, his name. Hyun-soo pointed at himself and said his own name slowly. The warrior tried to repeat it and failed spectacularly. Something between a cough and a sneeze came out instead. Hyun-soo almost smiled. Almost. Darok led him to the 3 sick figures under the hide shelter. He pulled back the covering, and Hyun-soo saw a young woman and 2 children lying on dried grass. Their skin was pale and slick with sweat. Their lips were cracked. The woman's breathing came in short, shallow gasps, and her eyes did not focus on anything. Darok's face changed when he looked at them. The hardness cracked for a moment. He placed his hand on the woman's forehead and spoke softly. Then he looked at Hyun-soo and pointed at the torch still burning in his hand, then at the sick, then at the sky. The message was unmistakable. You brought fire from nothing. You brought food from the air. Now heal them. Fix this, because you are a god, and gods fix things. Hyun-soo's jaw tightened. He knelt beside the woman and looked at her closely. He was not a doctor. He was a procurement manager. He knew how to source antibiotics from 3 competing pharmaceutical distributors and negotiate a bulk discount. He did not know how to diagnose a fever in a prehistoric world with no thermometer and no lab work. But he could read the signs anyone could read. High fever, dehydration, shallow breathing, possible infection, maybe pneumonia, maybe something worse. He opened the system catalog in his mind. Antibiotics Basic Course, 2,000 points. He had 365, not even close. He scrolled further. Herbal fever reducer, 50 points. Clean water, 1 liter, 10 points. Basic wound disinfectant, 40 points. He did the math. 100 points for the most basic medical supplies. That would leave him 265. And he still had no food solution beyond jerky packs that cost 30 each. He selected the fever reducer and the water. 60 points gone. A small clay pot of dark liquid and a sealed container of water appeared in his hands. The people watching gasped. A woman behind him dropped to her knees and began chanting something rhythmic and low. Hyun-soo ignored the worship and focused on the patient. He lifted the young woman's head gently and brought the water to her lips. She drank weakly. He mixed a measure of the fever reducer into a second pour of water and helped her swallow it. Then he did the same for the 2 children. Smaller doses, careful amounts. The old woman with the walking stick hobbled forward and watched everything with sharp, dark eyes that missed nothing. She was short and bent by age, but her gaze was steady and fierce. She reached out and took the clay pot from Hyun-soo's hands without asking. She sniffed it. She dipped a finger in and tasted it. Her eyes narrowed. She said something to Darok, a long string of words delivered in a tone that suggested she was not asking permission but making a judgment. Darok listened and nodded. The old woman looked at Hyun-soo. She pointed at the pot. Then she pointed at a cluster of dried plants hanging from one of the shelters. Then she pointed at herself and spoke with absolute authority. Hyun-soo understood. She was the healer here, the one who knew the local plants and remedies, and she was telling him that she recognized what was in his pot. Not the exact substance, but the principle. Medicine. She had been doing this her whole life with whatever this land provided. Now a stranger had appeared with better medicine from the sky, and she was deciding whether to be his enemy or his ally. Hyun-soo bowed his head to her, a gesture of respect that needed no translation. He held out the pot toward her and nodded. Take it. Study it. You know more about these people and their bodies than I ever will. The old woman stared at him for 3 long breaths. Then she took the pot and turned back to the patients. She began working, mixing his fever reducer with something from her own collection of dried herbs, grinding them together with a stone, applying a paste to the children's chests. Her hands moved with the precision of decades of practice. Hyun-soo stepped back and let her work. Darok watched the exchange with visible surprise. He had expected the god to command, not to defer. Hyun-soo walked to the edge of the camp and sat down on a flat rock. The system window hovered patiently before his eyes. Balance 305 points. He needed to think. He had 43 mouths to feed and 3 sick people who needed medicine he could not afford. The jerky packs were a stopgap. Each one fed maybe 5 people for 1 meal. At 30 points per pack, he would burn through his remaining balance in days, and then he would be just another hungry mouth with no fire and no miracles left. He needed income. The system had told him the rules at the start. Points for development, points for progress. If he taught these people something that improved their lives, the system would reward him. But what could he teach right now with 305 points and a group of starving hunter-gatherers who thought he was a deity? He opened the catalog and scrolled to the seeds category. Wheat seeds, 500 points. Too expensive. Wild herb garden starter, 200 points. Closer, but still painful. Root vegetable tubers, 150 points. He stopped. Root vegetables. Hardy crops that grew underground and survived bad weather. Calorie-dense and simple to cultivate, even for people who had never farmed a day in their lives. 150 points would leave him 155. Tight, but survivable if the investment paid off. He thought about it the way he would have thought about a purchase order back at the office. Cost 150. Expected return, enough food to reduce hunting pressure and keep the tribe fed through a lean season. Risk that these people had never planted anything intentionally and might fail on the first attempt. Mitigation, he would buy a basic farming guide along with the seeds. He checked the catalog. Illustrated Farming Guide, Basic Root Vegetables. 40 points. 150 plus 40. 190 total. Remaining balance, 115. His stomach tightened. That was cutting it close. One emergency and he would be broke. But he had learned something in 12 years of procurement. The companies that hoarded budget out of fear always ran out anyway, because they never built the capacity to earn more. The ones that invested early and smart grew their revenue and never looked back. He selected both items. A leather pouch of tubers and a thin scroll of illustrated instructions appeared in his hands. The system pulsed. He stood up and walked back to the center of camp. Darok was waiting. Hyun-soo knelt on the ground and unrolled the scroll. Simple drawings. A stick figure digging a hole, dropping a tuber in, covering it with dirt, watering it, waiting. A plant growing upward, more tubers underground. Harvest. He pointed at the drawings one by one. Then he held up a tuber and pointed at the ground. Darok frowned. He looked at the tuber. He looked at the dirt. He looked back at Hyun-soo with the expression of a man being asked to believe that rocks could swim. But Darok was a leader who had watched his people starve for months. He had tried everything he knew. Hunting was failing. The game had moved on or died off. Gathering brought less each week. His people were eating bark and roots they dug up by accident. And now, the god who had pulled fire and meat from nothing was pointing at the ground and saying, "Food lives here if you put it there first." Darok looked at the scroll again. He studied the drawings. Then he picked up a sharp stone and began to dig. Darok dug for an hour without stopping. His hands bled where the sharp stone scraped his knuckles, but he did not slow down. 2 other warriors joined him after watching from a distance. They did not understand what they were doing. They only knew that the god had pointed at the ground and their chief had started digging. That was enough. Hyun-soo guided them through the scroll illustrations step by step. Dig a hole the length of a forearm. Drop the tuber in with the eye facing up. Cover it with loose soil. Space each hole 2 paces apart. Move on. Repeat. The concept was so alien to them that the first warrior planted a tuber upside down and packed the dirt so hard nothing could have pushed through it. Hyun-soo corrected him gently. Not with words, because words were useless between them. With his hands. He knelt beside the man and loosened the soil with his fingers. He turned the tuber over and placed it correctly. The warrior watched and nodded. He did it right the next time. By midday, they had planted 30 tubers in a rough patch of cleared ground near the camp. It was not a farm. It was barely a garden. But it was the first time in the history of this world that anyone had put food into the earth on purpose and expected it to grow back. The system pulsed. A notification appeared in the corner of the blue window. Achievement unlocked. First agricultural act in tribal territory. Reward, 200 points. Hyun-soo exhaled slowly. 200 points. His balance climbed from 115 to 315. The investment had already returned more than the seeds cost. He felt a familiar satisfaction, the same feeling he got when a bulk order came in under budget and ahead of schedule. The math worked. The strategy was right. Spend on capacity, not on consumption. But the tubers would take weeks to grow, and the tribe needed to eat tonight. He opened the catalog and bought 2 more jerky packs. 60 points. Balance, 255. He handed the food to Darok, who distributed it with the careful rationing of a man who had counted every mouthful for months. Each person got a strip or 2. Not enough to fill a stomach, enough to keep moving. The 3 sick patients under the hide shelter were improving. The young woman's breathing had steadied. One of the children was sitting up and watching the planting with curious eyes. Old Mago had mixed Hyun-soo's fever reducer with her own herbal paste and applied it through the night. She had also forced water into them every hour using a hollowed gourd. Her methods were crude but effective, and Hyun-soo recognized something in her that he respected. She was a professional, limited by her tools but not by her mind. He approached her that afternoon. She was grinding dried leaves between 2 flat stones. He sat down beside her and opened the system catalog where only he could see it. He scrolled through the medicine section, looking for something specific. Not a finished product this time, a reference. Medicinal Plant Identification Guide for Temperate Grasslands. 80 points. He hesitated. That was a significant chunk of his remaining balance. But Mago already knew dozens of local plants. What she lacked was systematic knowledge. Which ones reduced fever? Which ones fought infection? Which ones were poison? If he could give her a guide that matched the plants she already had access to, she would become 10 times more effective without him spending another point on medicine. He bought it. A rolled leather scroll appeared in his hands, detailed illustrations of plants with simple symbols indicating their uses. A leaf symbol for fever, a drop symbol for wounds, a skull symbol for poison. Mago stared at the scroll as he unrolled it. Her eyes moved across the illustrations with the intensity of a hawk tracking prey. She grabbed it from his hands and held it close to her face. Her finger jabbed at one drawing. She looked up at Hyun-soo and spoke rapidly. Then she stood and walked to the edge of camp. She came back moments later holding a fistful of green stalks. She slapped them down next to the scroll and pointed at a matching illustration. The same plant. She already had it. She had been using it for years without knowing its full potential. Now she could see that it was marked with the leaf symbol, fever reducer. She had been using it for stomach pains. Her eyes went wide. She looked at Hyun-soo, and for the first time, her expression was not suspicion or judgment. It was hunger. The hunger of a mind that had been starving for knowledge in a world that offered none. Hyun-soo pointed at the other illustrations, and then at the land around them. Go find them. Learn them. She did not need to be told twice. She rolled up the scroll and tucked it under her arm and marched into the grassland with the determination of a woman on a mission. The system pulsed again. Knowledge transfer initiated. Tribal healer advancing. Reward 150 points. Balance from 175 to 325. Hyun-soo sat back on the flat rock and watched the camp. Warriors planting tubers they did not understand. A healer hunting for plants she could now identify. Sick patients breathing easier under a hide shelter. Children chewing jerky and staring at him with enormous eyes. He was not a god. He was a procurement manager sitting on a rock in the Stone Age, doing what he had always done, finding the right product for the right need at the right time at the best possible price. The difference was that back in Seoul, the stakes were quarterly earnings and client satisfaction reports. Here, the stakes were whether a child with a fever would survive the night. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, and the air was cooling fast. Hyun-soo realized something he had not considered. Night. These people had no reliable fire. The torch he had summoned was still burning, but it would not last forever. And when darkness fell, this camp with no walls and no perimeter would be open to whatever predators roamed the savannah after sunset. He could hear distant sounds already, low rumbling calls that vibrated through the ground. Something large was out there. Darok appeared beside him. The chief's hands were caked in dirt, and his face was drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes were alert. He pointed toward the darkening horizon and made a sound low in his throat, a warning sound. Then he picked up his obsidian spear and planted it in the ground beside the fire. He looked at Hyun-soo, and the question in his eyes was simple. Can your magic protect us from what comes in the dark? Hyun-soo opened the catalog. Permanent campfire kit with flint and steel, 50 points. He selected it. A bundle of prepared kindling and 2 pieces of shaped metal appeared at his feet. He picked up the steel and the flint and struck them together. Sparks flew. He struck again over the kindling and a flame caught. Small at first, then growing as he fed it with dry grass. The fire rose into the gathering darkness and pushed the shadows back. Darok watched the sparks with fascination. Hyun-soo handed him the flint and steel and guided his hands. Strike down at an angle, firm and fast. Darok tried and failed. Tried again. On the 5th attempt, a shower of sparks leaped from the metal. Darok froze. He looked at the tools in his hands, then at Hyun-soo, then at the fire. He understood. This was not magic that only the god could perform. This was a thing, a tool, a thing that anyone could use. Darok struck the flint again. More sparks. He struck faster, and a tiny flame caught on a tuft of grass in his other hand. He held it up like a trophy and shouted to the camp. Warriors gathered, eyes wide. Darok demonstrated again. Spark, flame, fire from stone and metal in the hands of a man. Not a god, a man. The camp erupted, not in worship this time, in something closer to wonder. The fire burned all night. Darok assigned 2 warriors to feed it, and they took the job with the seriousness of men guarding a sacred relic, which to them it was. Hyun-soo slept on the ground near the flames, with his torn office shirt rolled under his head as a pillow. The ground was cold and hard, and something with too many legs crawled across his ankle in the dark. He did not sleep well. But he slept alive, and that was more than he had expected when 5 spears were pointed at his chest the day before. He woke before dawn. The sky was gray, and the air was sharp with cold. Mist hung low over the grassland, and the camp was quiet except for the soft crackling of embers. He sat up and opened the system. Balance, 275 points. He reviewed his spending in his head, the way he used to review monthly procurement reports. Total points earned since arrival, 500, starting, plus 200 for agriculture, plus 150 for knowledge transfer. Total, 850. Total spent, 585. Current balance, 275, with no guaranteed income until the tubers grew or he found another way to generate progress points. He needed a plan. Not a survival plan. He had survived. He needed an economic plan, a growth strategy. Something that would turn this starving camp into a functioning settlement that generated enough progress to keep the system feeding him points. He thought about what a tribe needed in order of priority: food, water, shelter, security, medicine. Each category was a potential source of points, if he could advance it. Food was in progress with the tubers, but weeks away from harvest. Water was a problem he had not yet addressed. The tribe drank from a stream about half a kilometer from camp. He had seen 2 women make the trip yesterday, carrying water in animal bladders that leaked from every seam. Shelter was the collection of sticks and hides that barely qualified as structures. Security was Darok and his warriors, with obsidian spears and no defensive perimeter. Medicine was Mago and her new plant guide. He prioritized. Water first. A reliable water source closer to camp would save hours of daily labor and reduce the risk of predator encounters during the long walk to the stream. He opened the catalog. Clay water vessels, set of 5, 60 points. Rope woven, 20 meters, 30 points. He paused on the rope. Rope was not just for carrying water. Rope was one of the most fundamental technologies in human history. With rope, you could bind shelters together, create snares for small game, tie tools to handles, lash logs into rafts or walls. Rope was an investment that multiplied every other resource. He bought the rope. 30 points. Balance 245. A coil of sturdy woven cord appeared in his hands. He held it up and examined it. Good quality. Flexible but strong. He could feel the braided fibers under his fingers, and for a brief, absurd moment, he thought about the supplier evaluation forms he used to fill out at the office, rating materials on tensile strength and cost per meter. He would have given this rope a solid 8 out of 10. He carried the rope to where Darok was already awake, sharpening an obsidian blade by the fire. The chief looked at the rope with open curiosity. Hyun-soo demonstrated. He tied a knot around a stick. He pulled it tight. He showed how the rope could bind 2 sticks together into a cross shape. Darok tested the knot with his full strength, and when it held, his eyebrows rose. He took the rope and began experimenting immediately. Within minutes, he had bound 3 sticks into a frame and was testing its strength by hanging his weight from it. A younger warrior came over and watched. Then another. Soon, 4 men were working with the rope, tying and untying and discovering what held and what did not. Hyun-soo left them to it and turned his attention to the water problem. He walked to the stream with 2 of the women who made the daily trip. The path was dangerous. Tall grass on both sides with limited visibility. Animal tracks crossed the trail in several places, large prints with deep claw marks. The women walked fast and kept their eyes moving. They had made this trip hundreds of times, and they knew exactly what was out there. The stream itself was clear and cold. It ran over smooth stones at the bottom of a shallow ravine. Good water. But the distance from camp made it a liability. Hyun-soo studied the terrain. The stream flowed from higher ground to the east. If he followed it upstream, he might find a point closer to camp where they could access it more easily. He walked upstream for 20 minutes and found what he was looking for. A natural bend where the stream curved close to a rocky outcrop. The distance to camp from here was maybe 200 meters instead of 500. And the rocky ground meant better visibility and fewer places for predators to hide. He marked the spot in his mind and walked back to camp. He needed containers. The animal bladders the women used were inadequate. They leaked and they could not hold enough, and they wore out quickly. Clay vessels would solve the problem, but he did not want to buy finished pots from the system. That was consumption, not investment. He wanted the tribe to make their own. He opened the catalog. Pottery instruction guide with clay identification. 70 points. He winced. His balance was already down to 245. This would drop him to 175. But pottery was not just about water storage. Pottery meant cooking vessels, storage containers, eventually trade goods. It was another technology that multiplied everything it touched. He bought it. A scroll appeared, more illustrations. Clay deposits shown by color and texture, shaping techniques, drying methods, a simple pit firing process. He needed someone to teach this to. Not Darok. The chief was busy with the rope and the warriors and the security of the camp. Hyun-soo looked around and his eyes landed on a young man sitting at the edge of the group, watching everything with sharp, restless eyes. He was lean and wiry, with quick hands that fidgeted constantly. A teenager, maybe 15 or 16. He had a fresh scar across his left forearm, and the kind of energy that comes from being young and bored and desperate to prove something. Hyun-soo walked over and held out the pottery scroll. The young man looked up. His eyes were bright and suspicious. Hyun-soo unrolled the scroll and pointed at the first illustration. A riverbank with colored clay deposits. Then he pointed toward the stream. The young man looked at the scroll, then at the stream, then back at Hyun-soo. He grabbed the scroll and stood up so fast he nearly knocked Hyun-soo over. He said something short and sharp. Hyun-soo did not understand the words, but the tone was clear. Show me where. They walked to the stream together. Along the banks, Hyun-soo matched the scroll illustrations to the actual terrain. Red-brown clay deposits were visible in the cuts where the water had eroded the bank. He pointed at the clay and then at the scroll illustration. The young man crouched down and dug his fingers into the deposit. He pulled out a handful of wet clay and squeezed it. It held its shape. He squeezed it again, and a grin spread across his face. He looked at Hyun-soo and thumped his chest. Krom. His name. Krom took the clay back to camp and spent the rest of the morning trying to shape it into a bowl following the scroll illustrations. His first 3 attempts collapsed. The 4th held its shape, but cracked when it dried too fast in the sun. Hyun-soo pointed at the section of the scroll showing slow drying in shade. Krom studied it and tried again. By afternoon, he had produced a rough, lopsided bowl that held water without leaking. It was ugly. It was uneven. It was the first piece of pottery in the history of Garun. The system pulsed. New craft initiated in tribal territory. Pottery foundations established. Reward 250 points. Balance jumped from 175 to 425. Hyun-soo felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. The economy was working. Every skill he introduced earned points. Every point funded the next skill. The cycle was building momentum. He sat by the fire that evening and watched the camp. Darok was demonstrating rope knots to the warriors. Krom was making his 6th attempt at a clay bowl, surrounded by 3 children who watched with open mouths. Mago had returned from the grassland with an armful of plants and was sorting them by the illustrations in her scroll. The 3 sick patients were sitting up now. The young woman had eaten a strip of jerky on her own. One of the children was standing. 43 people who had been dying a day ago were now planting and tying and shaping and healing. Not because a god told them to, because someone had handed them the right tools and stepped back. The system window glowed softly in the darkness. Balance 425 points. And somewhere in the tall grass beyond the firelight, something growled low and long and patient. The growling came closer after midnight. Hyun-soo was half asleep when Darok shook him by the shoulder and pointed into the darkness beyond the fire. 2 pairs of eyes reflected the flames, low to the ground, spaced wide apart. Something big was circling the camp. Darok gripped his obsidian spear and positioned himself between the fire and the dark. 4 warriors joined him in a line. Their faces were calm, with the practiced calm of men who had faced predators before and knew that fear was a luxury they could not afford. Hyun-soo stood behind them and opened the system. His hands were steady, but his pulse was not. He scrolled through the catalog, looking for something useful. Weapon category. Obsidian spear improved, 40 points. Iron knife, 300 points. Too expensive. Wooden shield reinforced, 35 points. He needed to think like a procurement manager, not like a frightened man in the dark. What was the most cost-effective way to protect 43 people from predators on an ongoing basis? Buying weapons for one night was a bandage, not a solution. He needed a perimeter. He scrolled to the construction category. Wooden stake fence kit, 20 stakes with sharpened tips, 60 points. He selected it. 20 pointed wooden stakes appeared in a bundle on the ground beside him. Each one was about chest height and sharpened to a wicked point at the top. Not a wall, but a barrier. Something that would make a predator think twice before charging into camp. He grabbed a stake and drove it into the ground with both hands. It sank into the soft earth and stood upright. He grabbed another and planted it 2 paces away. Darok turned and saw what he was doing. The chief understood immediately. A fence. A line of sharp points between his people and the things in the dark. He barked orders. 3 warriors broke from the defensive line and began planting stakes alongside Hyun-soo. They worked fast, driving each stake deep and angling the points outward. In 20 minutes, they had created a rough semicircle of sharpened wood around the most vulnerable side of the camp. It was crude. Gaps between the stakes were too wide in places, and some leaned at awkward angles. But it was a barrier where none had existed before. The eyes in the darkness watched the activity and did not come closer. The growling faded. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, the predators had moved on. Hyun-soo leaned against a stake and let out a long breath. Balance 365 points. He had spent 60 on stakes, but saved every life in the camp. That was a return on investment he could live with. The morning brought a new problem. One of the hunters came running into camp, shouting and waving his arms. Darok intercepted him, and the two men spoke rapidly. Hyun-soo could not understand the words, but the hunter's gestures told the story. He was pointing south, making broad, sweeping motions with his arms, then holding up fingers, many fingers. Darok's face went hard. He turned to Hyun-soo and pointed south. Then he held up both fists and opened them 3 times. 30. 30-something to the south. Hyun-soo did not need a translator to understand. Another group, another tribe, 30 strong and heading this way. Darok was not afraid. His jaw was set and his grip on the spear was white-knuckled, but his eyes were calculating. He was a chief assessing a threat, not panicking, planning. Hyun-soo respected that. He held up his hand to Darok. Wait, let me think. He sat down by the fire and opened the system. His mind raced through scenarios the way it used to race through supply chain disruptions at the office. An incoming tribe of 30 could mean several things. They might be migrating and pass through without conflict. They might be starving and desperate enough to raid the camp for food. They might be hostile by nature and looking for easy targets. Or they might be curious about the smoke rising from a camp that suddenly had fire and food and activity. He needed information before he could plan. He scrolled through the catalog for something that could help. Scouting was not a purchasable skill. Binoculars were in the tools section at 100 points, too expensive for a single-use item. He stopped on a simpler option. Signal horn. Carved bone. 15 points. Not for fighting, for communication. If you positioned scouts around the camp, they could blow the horn to warn of approaching strangers long before they arrived. Early warning was worth more than weapons. He bought the horn. A curved piece of polished bone appeared in his hand. He blew into it, and a deep, resonant tone rolled across the savannah. Every head in camp turned. Darok's eyes went wide. Hyun-soo handed the horn to the youngest warrior, a boy of maybe 14 with fast legs and sharp eyes. He pointed at the boy, then at the southern horizon. Then he put his hand to his ear. Watch, listen, warn us. The boy took the horn and sprinted south without hesitation. Darok watched him go and nodded slowly. He was beginning to understand the pattern. The god did not fight. The god prepared. Hyun-soo spent the next 2 hours fortifying the camp. He used the remaining rope to lash the stake fence tighter and fill the gaps. He directed warriors to dig a shallow trench on the open side of the camp, not deep enough to stop a charge, but enough to slow one down and make attackers stumble. Krom abandoned his pottery and joined the work with ferocious energy. The young man hauled rocks from the stream and piled them along the trench line. Improvised obstacles. No one told him to do it. He saw the pattern and added to it on his own. Hyun-soo noticed and filed it away. Krom was not just enthusiastic. He was smart. The kind of smart that looks at a problem and invents half the solution before anyone explains the other half. By midday, the camp had a crude but functional defensive ring. Stakes on the west, trench and rocks on the south. The stream ravine served as a natural barrier on the east. Only the north was open, and Darok positioned his best warriors there with spears ready. It was not a fortress. It was barely a defended camp. But compared to the open cluster of sticks and hides that had existed 2 days ago, it was a revolution. The system pulsed. Defensive infrastructure established. Tribal security upgraded. Reward, 200 points. Balance climbed from 350 to 550. Hyun-soo allowed himself a small nod. The numbers were moving in the right direction. Spend to build. Build to earn. Earn to spend again. The cycle was accelerating. The horn sounded in the early afternoon. A single long note from the south. Every warrior in camp grabbed a weapon. Women gathered children and moved to the center of the ring. Mago stood over her sick patients with a stone blade in one hand and a look that dared anything to come through her. Hyun-soo stood beside Darok at the southern trench and watched the grass. Minutes passed. Then figures appeared on the horizon. Not 30, 12. A small group moving slowly through the tall grass. As they came closer, Hyun-soo could see that they were in worse shape than the Greystone tribe had been when he found them. Emaciated, hollow-eyed. 3 of them were being carried by the others. 2 were children so thin their arms looked like sticks. They were not raiders. They were refugees. The group stopped at the edge of the trench, and the one in front dropped to his knees. He was an older man, gaunt and trembling. He laid his spear on the ground in front of him and pressed his forehead to the dirt. Surrender. Supplication. He was begging. Darok looked at Hyun-soo. The chief's expression was conflicted. His instinct said these strangers were a threat. More mouths to feed. More bodies to protect. Resources stretched thinner across more people. Every survival calculation said, turn them away. Hyun-soo looked at the kneeling man and the starving children behind him. Then he looked at the system window. Balance 550 points. Points for development. Points for progress. The system rewarded him for lifting people out of misery. These 12 broken, starving souls were not a cost. They were an investment. He turned to Darok and nodded once. Let them in. The 12 refugees ate like animals. Hyun-soo bought 2 jerky packs and watched them tear through the dried meat with shaking hands. The old man who had knelt at the trench was their leader. His name was Baran, and he spoke in a dialect close enough to Darok's that the 2 chiefs could communicate with effort. Baran's tribe had been called the River Elk, 40 strong at their peak, now 12. Disease had taken the first wave. Then a raid from a larger tribe to the south had scattered the rest. Buren had gathered whoever could still walk and fled north, hoping to find game or mercy, or both. He found neither, until the smoke from Greystone's fire led him here. Darok listened to Buren's story with a face carved from stone. When the old man finished, Darok looked at Hyun-soo. The question in his eyes was clear. Can we afford this? Hyun-soo did the math. 55 people now. His jerky supply was a temporary fix, and the tubers would not be ready for weeks. But 12 new bodies meant 12 new workers. If he could put them to useful labor immediately, the system would reward the expansion. He opened the catalog. Another set of root vegetable tubers, 150 points. A second coil of rope, 30 points. He bought both. Balance dropped from 490 to 310. He handed the tubers to Buren and pointed at the garden patch where Darok's people were already tending the first planting. Buren stared at the tubers, then at the cleared ground with its neat rows of turned earth. His mouth opened and closed. He had never seen intentional planting. None of them had. But hunger is the fastest teacher in any century. By evening, Buren's people were digging alongside Greystone warriors. Hands that had held spears for survival now pushed tubers into dark soil. The system pulsed. Tribal expansion. Refugee integration initiated. Reward 300 points. Balance jumped to 610. Hyun-soo nodded to himself. The math was proving right. More people meant more progress, meant more points. But it also meant more risk. Burn had mentioned a larger tribe to the south, the ones who had destroyed the river elk. Hyun-soo pulled Darok aside, and through gestures and repeated words, managed to extract a name. Burn called them the Red Fang, and he held up both hands and flashed all 10 fingers 6 times when asked how many warriors they had. 60 fighters. Hyun-soo's stomach tightened. He had 55 people total, maybe 18 able warriors if he counted Burren's surviving men. Against 60 hardened raiders, that was not a battle. That was a massacre. He needed time. Time for the tubers to grow. Time for the defenses to strengthen. Time for the tribe to learn enough skills that the system would keep funding his purchases. He spent the next 3 days in a controlled frenzy of activity. He bought a bow construction guide for 80 points and handed it to Krom. The young man studied the illustrations with the same fierce intensity he had brought to pottery. Within 2 days, he had carved a crude short bow from a flexible branch and strung it with a length of sinew. It was rough and its range was laughable, but when Krom fitted a sharpened stick to the string and sent it flying 20 paces into a hide target, the warriors watching let out a sound that was half gasp and half war cry. They had never seen a projectile weapon. Every fight they knew was spear range or closer. The idea that you could strike an enemy from a distance without exposing yourself was revolutionary. Krom made a second bow, then a third. He taught 2 other young hunters to shoot. Their aim was terrible, but their enthusiasm was bottomless. The system rewarded the weapon's advancement with 200 points. Balance climbed to 530 after the bow guide purchase. Hyun-soo reinvested immediately. A basic tanning guide for 50 points. Leather was the next logical step. Better clothing, better armor, better bags for carrying water and storing food. He gave the tanning scroll to one of Buron's women, who had experience scraping hides. She took to it with quiet efficiency, and by the 4th day had produced a piece of soft, workable leather from a deer hide that the hunters had brought in. The system added another 150 points for the new craft. Mago was flourishing. The old healer had identified 11 new medicinal plants from her guide, and was experimenting with combinations that Hyun-soo's scroll had not even suggested. She had created a poultice that reduced swelling and a tea that eased stomach cramps. The sick patients were fully recovered now and working alongside everyone else. Mago had also taken on an apprentice, a quiet girl from Buron's group who followed the old woman everywhere and ground herbs without being asked. Knowledge spreading on its own. That was the compound interest Hyun-soo had been hoping for. On the 5th day after the refugees arrived, the young scout with the signal horn came running back to camp. He was out of breath and his face was white. He did not blow the horn. He spoke directly to Darok in a rush of frantic words. Darok's expression darkened. He turned to Hyun-soo and held up his fist. Then he opened it, then closed it, then opened it again, counting. The scout had seen movement to the south. Not 12 refugees this time. A war party. Painted faces and sharpened spears, moving through the grassland in organized formation. Red Fang. They were not coming to trade or beg. They were coming to take. Hyun-soo looked at his balance. 630 points. He looked at the crude fence and shallow trench surrounding the camp. He looked at Krom and his 3 bowmen with their rough short bows. He looked at Darok standing tall with his obsidian spear and the fierce, desperate pride of a man who had finally found something worth defending. Not enough. Not nearly enough. But the procurement manager in him had faced impossible deadlines before. The trick was never to panic. The trick was to prioritize. Hyun-soo had maybe 2 days before the war party arrived. The scout estimated their pace from the distance and direction of travel. 60 warriors moving through open grassland did not move fast. They foraged as they went, and they were confident. An army that size in the Stone Age had no reason to hurry. Nothing in this world could challenge them. Hyun-soo intended to change that calculation. He sat by the fire that night and opened the system catalog. He needed force multipliers. Things that made 18 defenders fight like 50. He scrolled through the weapons section and resisted every impulse to buy finished products. A crate of iron spears would cost 800 points and leave him broke. And when they broke or were captured, he would have nothing. Instead, he focused on knowledge and infrastructure. Defensive Fortification Guide, 60 points. A scroll showing how to build palisade walls with sharpened logs, angled stakes to slow a charge, choke points to funnel attackers into kill zones. He bought it and unrolled it in front of Darok. The chief studied the drawings with the focus of a man whose life depended on understanding them. And it did. Hyun-soo pointed at the tree line near camp. Logs. He pointed at the trench. Deeper. He pointed at the stake fence. Taller. Thicker. Darok nodded and started shouting orders. Every able body in camp went to work. Warriors felled small trees with obsidian axes and dragged them back. Women sharpened stakes with stone blades. Children carried rocks. Baran's refugees worked alongside Greystone's people with the desperate energy of those who had already lost one home. Krom split his time between fortification work and training his small archer squad. He had 4 bowmen now. Their accuracy was improving hour by hour as they practiced on hide targets pinned to stakes. The bows were still crude, but at close range, an arrow in the shoulder would stop a charging warrior as effectively as any modern weapon. Hyun-soo bought one more item: fire arrows. Not the arrows themselves, but the knowledge. A small scroll showing how to wrap arrow tips in oil-soaked cloth. 30 points. He did not have oil, but Mago provided a substitute. A thick resin she had been collecting from tree bark for years, sticky and flammable. Krom tested the first fire arrow at dusk. He lit the resin-wrapped tip in the campfire and drew the bow. The flame danced as the arrow flew and struck the ground 30 paces away. The dry grass caught instantly. A circle of fire spread outward before warriors stomped it dead. Krom looked at the scorched ground and then at Hyun-soo. His grin was savage. By the end of the first day, the camp had transformed. The shallow trench was now waist deep on the southern approach. Sharpened stakes lined the bottom at angles designed to impale anyone who jumped in. The palisade wall had doubled in height, with fresh logs lashed together by rope. 2 narrow gaps served as controlled entry points. Inside those gaps, Hyun-soo had directed the placement of large rocks at staggered intervals. Any attacker who made it through would have to navigate a maze of obstacles while defenders struck from above. It was not a castle. It was a Stone Age fortress built in 30 hours by people who had never conceived of such a thing. The system rewarded the effort. Advanced defensive construction, settlement fortification achieved. Reward, 400 points. Balance shot up to 940. Hyun-soo stared at the number. 940 points. His highest balance yet. The temptation to spend it on overwhelming firepower was strong. He could buy metal weapons, armor, even basic explosive compounds if the catalog listed them. But he stopped himself. He was a procurement manager. He knew the difference between spending and investing. Metal weapons in the hands of untrained fighters were just expensive clubs. What his people needed was not better gear, but better coordination. He spent the second day on tactics. Through Darok, he organized the defenders into 3 groups. Krom's archers on the palisade wall with fire arrows ready. Darok's spearmen behind the wall at the entry gaps. And a reserve group of 8 fighters hidden in the tall grass on the eastern flank. The reserve was Hyun-soo's idea, not from the catalog, from 12 years of watching supply chain ambushes in corporate negotiations. When your opponent commits everything to the front, the winning move comes from the side. He drilled them on the plan 3 times. Darok relayed instructions, and the warriors practiced their positions. It was clumsy, They bumped into each other and argued about placement, and one man tripped into the trench he had helped dig. But by the third rehearsal, they moved with something approaching coordination. The sun set on the second day. The camp was as ready as it would ever be. Hyun-soo stood on the palisade and looked south. Somewhere out there, 60 painted warriors were sleeping around their own fires, sharpening their spears and expecting an easy raid on a weak tribe they had heard rumors about. They did not know about the wall. They did not know about the trench. They did not know about the arrows or the fire or the flanking force in the grass. Darok climbed up beside him. The old chief's face was grim but steady. He placed his fist against his chest and spoke. Hyun-soo did not understand every word, but he understood the meaning. We are ready, whatever comes. Hyun-soo looked at his balance one more time, 940 points. He would hold them in reserve, emergency procurement. The battle would begin with what they had built. The system's points were the last line of defense, not the first. He closed the catalog and watched the darkness. They came at dawn. The sound reached the camp before the sight, a rhythmic pounding of feet and spear shafts against the ground, a war chant that rolled across the savannah like approaching thunder. Hyun-soo stood on the palisade beside Krom and watched the grass part as the Red Fang emerged in a broad line. They were exactly what Garun had described. Painted faces in red and black, bone necklaces rattling against scarred chests, obsidian blades lashed to heavy wooden shafts, bigger than Greystone's warriors on average, better fed, more confident. Their leader walked at the center of the line, a massive man with a shaved head and a jaw like a stone slab. He carried a club the size of Hyun-soo's leg, with a jagged obsidian head bound to it by sinew. He stopped 50 paces from the palisade and stared. Whatever he had expected to find, it was not a wall. His war party slowed behind him, and the chanting faltered. 60 warriors had come to raid a starving camp and found a fortress instead. The shaved leader recovered quickly. He raised his club and roared. The sound was enormous, raw and furious, and meant to break the will of anyone listening. Behind him, the war party surged forward. They charged in a mass, no formation, no tactics, just 60 bodies sprinting toward the wall with weapons raised and murder in their eyes. It was the only way they knew how to fight. Krom drew his bow. 3 other archers drew beside him. Hyun-soo had told them to wait until the first runners hit the trench. The distance closed. 80 paces, 60, 40. The first Red Fang warrior reached the trench at full sprint and disappeared. His scream was short and terrible. The man behind him tried to stop and stumbled in after him. A third managed to jump but landed on a sharpened stake on the far side and went down howling. The charge broke apart at the trench line. Warriors skidded to a halt. Some tried to go around. Others jumped and made it across, only to face the angled stakes on the other side. In that moment of confusion, Krom loosed his first fire arrow. The burning shaft arced through the gray dawn and struck the dry grass behind the Red Fang line. Flames erupted. The 3 other archers fired in sequence. 4 streaks of fire landed in a rough line that cut off the attackers from easy retreat. Smoke billowed across the field. The Red Fang leader bellowed commands. He was trying to reorganize his warriors to push through the entry gaps in the palisade. 20 fighters gathered around him and charged the nearest gap. They hit the opening 3 abreast and immediately slowed. The rocks inside forced them to weave and stumble. Darok was waiting. The old chief stood at the inner end of the gap with 10 spearmen in a tight line. When the first Red Fang warrior squeezed through the obstacles, Darok drove his obsidian spear into the man's shoulder and shoved him backward into those behind. The gap became a choke point of tangled bodies. Spears stabbed from both sides. The attackers could not use their numbers. 2 men at a time was all the gap allowed, and Darok's warriors cut them down with methodical precision. Hyun-soo watched from the wall. His heart was slamming against his ribs. This was not a spreadsheet. This was blood and screaming and the smell of burning grass. He forced himself to focus. The plan was working, but the second gap was under pressure. A group of Red Fang fighters had found it and were pushing through with brute force. The defenders there were being pushed back. Hyun-soo made the call. He cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted, a wordless yell directed at the eastern flank, the signal. 8 warriors erupted from the tall grass on the Red Fang's right side. They hit the exposed flank at full sprint with spears leveled. The effect was devastating. Attackers caught between the wall in front and a charge from the side panicked. Some threw down their weapons. Others tried to run and tangled with their own retreating comrades. The shaved leader saw his flank collapse, and for the first time, his face showed something other than rage. It showed doubt. He pulled his remaining fighters back 50 paces and regrouped. Half his force was scattered or down. The trench had broken the initial charge. The fire had cut retreat. The gaps had turned into killing grounds. And now warriors were hitting his side from the grass. This was not supposed to happen. Starving tribes did not fight like this. Nobody in this world fought like this. Hyun-soo opened the system. Balance 940. He had one move left. Not a weapon, not armor, a signal. He scrolled to the tools section. Smoke signal flare, 25 points. A thick bundle appeared in his hand, trailing orange smoke the moment he lit it. He climbed to the top of the palisade and held it high. Bright orange smoke rose into the morning sky in a pillar visible for miles. Every eye on the battlefield turned to it. The Red Fang warriors saw a tower of colored smoke rising from a fortress they could not breach, held by a tribe that fought with fire and walls and tactics they had never encountered. And standing on top of that wall, silhouetted against the orange sky, was the figure who had built it all. Hyun-soo did not look like a god. He looked like a man in a torn office shirt with dirt on his face and terror in his chest. But from 50 paces away in the smoke and chaos, he looked like something these warriors had no word for, something that could not be beaten with clubs and spears. The shaved leader stared at the smoke, then at the wall, then at his broken line. He lowered his club. He turned, and he walked away. His warriors followed, not running, walking. Beaten but not routed, proud enough to retreat on their feet. The battlefield emptied. Smoke drifted across the trampled grass. Groans rose from the trench. Darok leaned on his spear, breathing hard, with blood on his arms that was not his own. Krom stood on the wall with an arrow still nocked, staring south with wild eyes. Hyun-soo sat down on the palisade and closed his eyes. His hands were shaking. The system window blinked. Defensive victory against superior force. Tribal survival secured. Reward 500 points. Balance 1,415. The aftermath was ugly. 7 Red Fang warriors lay dead in and around the trench. 11 more were wounded too badly to follow their retreating comrades. They lay in the grass, groaning and bleeding, and waiting for the death blow that always came in this world. Darok stood over the nearest wounded man with his spear raised. One thrust, and it would be over. It was the way things were done. You killed the enemy's wounded, so they could not heal and come back to kill you later. Hyun-soo grabbed Darok's arm. The chief turned to him with confusion and anger in his eyes. Hyun-soo shook his head. No. Darok argued. His gestures were violent and clear. These men had come to kill them, to take their food and their women and their children. They deserved death. Every instinct of survival in this brutal world demanded it. Hyun-soo understood all of that, and he disagreed. He pointed at the wounded men. Then he pointed at the camp. Then he held up his hands and mimed working, digging, carrying, building. Darok stared at him. The concept was so foreign that it took a long moment to register. Prisoners. Not dead enemies. Workers. Darok looked at the wounded men, then at Hyun-soo. Then he slowly lowered his spear. He did not agree. But he had seen what the gods' strange ideas produced. Walls that stopped armies, fire that flew through the air, plants that grew from the ground on purpose. If the gods said spare them, then maybe there was a reason the chief could not yet see. Hyun-soo sent Mago to treat the wounded. The old healer did not hesitate. She had long since stopped questioning the orders that came from the stranger with the glowing eyes. She brought her herb pastes and her clean water and her new knowledge from the medicinal scroll, and she went to work. Some of the Greystone warriors watched with open hostility as their healer tended enemy wounded. Hyun-soo could feel the tension like heat from a fire. He needed to address it, but not with words he could not speak in their language. With results. He opened the system. Balance 1,415 points. He had never been this wealthy. The temptation to hoard was strong. But hoarding was what failing companies did right before they went bankrupt. He scrolled through the catalog with purpose. Grain seeds, wheat and barley starter pack. 400 points. This was the big one. Root vegetables had proven the concept of farming. Now it was time to scale up. Grain meant bread. Bread meant storable calories. Storable calories meant surviving winter without constant hunting. He bought it. A heavy leather sack appeared at his feet, filled with seeds that would not exist naturally in this world for thousands of years. Balance 1015. He carried the sack to the expanded garden plot and opened it in front of the assembled tribe. The golden seeds spilled into his palm and caught the morning light. Darok leaned in close and sniffed them. One of the river elk women reached out and took a single seed between her fingers. She studied it and then looked at the garden, where the tubers were already showing green shoots above the soil. She understood before anyone else. More planting, different crop, bigger harvest. She took the sack from Hyun-soo and walked to the garden. 3 women followed her without being asked. By afternoon, they had cleared a new section of ground twice the size of the tuber patch and were planting wheat in rows, following the patterns they had already learned. The system rewarded the advancement. Agricultural expansion, grain cultivation initiated. Reward 500 points. Balance climbed to 1,515. Hyun-soo spent more. A basic weaving loom guide, 60 points. Cloth would follow leather as the next material technology. A water purification method using sand and charcoal, 40 points. Clean water would reduce disease and boost productivity. A simple counting system illustrated on a scroll, 50 points. Mathematics, the foundation of everything that would come after. He handed each scroll to the person best suited to learn it. The weaving guide went to an older woman from Baran's group, whose fingers were nimble despite her age. The water purification method went to a river elk man who had already been managing the water runs to the closer stream access point. The counting scroll he kept for himself. He would need a shared language of numbers before he could teach anything more complex. Balance after the purchases was 1,365. The wounded Red Fang prisoners were recovering under Mago's care. 3 of the 11 had died from their injuries. 8 survived. They sat in a cluster near the edge of camp, watched by 2 guards and wearing expressions that ranged from hostile to terrified. They expected death. Every precedent in their world said it was coming. Instead, Hyun-soo brought them food. 2 jerky packs, 60 points. He placed the meat in front of them and stepped back. The prisoners stared at the food, then at him, then at each other. One of them reached out and took a piece, then another. They ate in silence. Hyun-soo sat down across from them and opened the counting scroll. He held up one finger. Then he pointed at a mark on the scroll. 1. He held up 2 fingers. 2. The prisoners watched him with the wariness of trapped animals. But one of them leaned forward slightly. A young man, maybe Krom's age, with a deep gash across his thigh that Mago had stitched closed with bone needles. His eyes moved from the scroll to Hyun-soo's fingers and back. He held up his own hand. 3 fingers. He looked at the scroll and pointed at the 3rd mark. Hyun-soo nodded. The young prisoner almost smiled. Almost. The system did not pulse. No points for teaching a single prisoner to count to 3. But Hyun-soo had not done it for points. He had done it because a dead enemy costs you nothing and gains you nothing. A living enemy who learns to count might one day count the bushels of grain he helped grow. 3 weeks passed. The tubers came in. Green shoots pushed through the soil and thickened into leafy plants that the tribe watched with something close to reverence. The wheat was slower but steady, thin green blades rising in rows that looked nothing like the wild grass around them. Order imposed on chaos. The camp was no longer a camp. It was a settlement. The palisade wall had been extended to encircle the entire perimeter. Inside the walls, 12 new shelters stood in 2 rough rows. Not the leaning stick piles of before, but frame structures with lashed log walls and hide roofs reinforced with woven grass mats. Krom had built the first one as a prototype, and the design spread through the settlement like a song everyone wanted to sing. 67 people lived inside the walls now. The original 43 of Greystone, the 12 River Elk refugees, 4 more wanderers who had appeared from the east, drawn by the smoke of permanent fires and the smell of food. And the 8 Red Fang prisoners who were no longer guarded because they no longer tried to leave. The young prisoner with the leg wound was named Torak. He had learned to count to 100 in 2 weeks. He followed Hyun-soo everywhere, with the quiet intensity of a student who had found the only teacher in the world. Hyun-soo taught him through the counting scroll, and through gestures, and through the slow, painful process of building a shared vocabulary. Torak absorbed it all. Numbers, measurements, the concept of planning ahead. He was not just learning to count, he was learning to think in sequences. If this, then that. Cause and effect. The foundation of systematic reasoning in a mind that had never been given the tools for it. Mago had trained 3 apprentice healers. Her original student from Buron's group, plus 2 young women from Greystone who had shown aptitude. The medical knowledge was spreading faster than Hyun-soo had projected. Mago herself had moved beyond the plant guide into experimentation. She was testing combinations and documenting results through a system of colored marks on flat stones. Not writing, but the ancestor of writing. A recording method born from necessity and genius. The system had been generous. Progress points flowed in steadily as the settlement advanced. Each new skill, each new structure, each new mouth-fed added to the total. Hyun-soo's balance had grown to 2,200 points through accumulated rewards for agricultural progress, craft development, population growth, and social stability. He was richer than he had ever been in system terms, and he was about to spend a significant portion of it. He opened the catalog and navigated to a section he had been eyeing for weeks. Metal. Bronze ingot, 300 points. Iron ingot, 500 points. Basic forge construction guide, 200 points. Metal was the next revolution. Stone tools had carried them this far, but they had hard limits. Obsidian was sharp but brittle. It shattered on impact and could not be reshaped. Metal could be forged into any form, sharpened and resharpened, made into plows that would turn soil 10 times faster than digging sticks, made into axes that could fell trees in minutes instead of hours, made into weapons that would make the settlement untouchable. But metal required a forge, A forge required knowledge. Knowledge required a teacher. And Hyun-soo was not a blacksmith. He was a procurement manager who had once toured a steel mill as part of a supplier audit and remembered exactly nothing useful about metallurgy. He bought the forge guide, 200 points, and one bronze ingot as a demonstration piece, 300 points. Balance dropped from 2,200 to 1,700. The guide was detailed. Illustrations of a stone-lined pit forge, bellows made from leather, charcoal production from slow-burned wood, temperatures required, techniques for heating and hammering. He studied it himself first. Then he brought it to the one person who had shown the most natural talent for working with materials, Krom. The young man had evolved beyond recognition in 3 weeks. His pottery had improved from crude lumps to functional vessels with even walls. He had built shelter frames that others copied. He had invented a clay-lined fire pit for cooking that retained heat twice as long as an open flame. His hands understood materials the way a musician's hands understand strings, instinctively. Krom took the forge guide and the bronze ingot and vanished for 2 days. On the third morning, a thin stream of smoke rose from a new pit at the edge of the settlement. Hyun-soo walked over and found Krom crouched beside a stone-lined hole with makeshift leather bellows pumping air into a charcoal fire. The heat was intense. Krom's face was streaked with soot and sweat, and his eyes reflected the orange glow of the coals. The bronze ingot sat in a clay crucible in the center of the fire. As Hyun-soo watched, it began to soften, then glow, then slowly lose its shape as the metal turned liquid. Krom pulled the crucible from the fire with 2 green sticks and poured the molten bronze into a flat stone mold he had carved himself. The metal flowed and filled the shape. A blade, rough and simple, but unmistakable. They waited. The bronze cooled. Krom lifted the blade from the mold and held it up. It caught the sunlight and threw it back in a flash of gold. Every person in the settlement stopped what they were doing and stared. They had never seen metal. In their world, everything was stone or bone or wood. This was something entirely new, something that gleamed and held an edge and did not shatter when it struck. Darok approached slowly. Krom handed him the blade. The chief tested the edge against his thumb and drew a thin line of blood. His eyes went wide. He turned the blade over in his hands, examining every surface. Then he looked at Krom, not at Hyun-soo, at Krom. The boy who had been a restless teenager 3 weeks ago had just opened the door to a new age. The system confirmed it. Metallurgy initiated. Bronze working achieved. Reward 800 points. Balance surged to 2,500. Hyun-soo stood behind the small crowd gathered around the forge and watched. He was smiling. Not because of the points, because for the first time since he had arrived in this world, someone had taken a technology he provided and pushed it further than he had planned. He had given Krom a guide and a single ingot. Krom had built a forge from memory and intuition and produced a blade on his 3rd day of trying. The student was outgrowing the teacher. That was not a problem. That was the entire point. Word spread. It always does when something impossible happens in a world where nothing ever changes. Traders from distant tribes had been appearing at the settlement for days. Lone hunters who wandered close enough to see the walls and the smoke and the green rows of crops growing in deliberate lines. They came with wide eyes and left with stories. A walled village, fire that never dies, plants that grow where you tell them to, a blade that shines like captured sunlight, and a god who walks among mortals and pulls miracles from the air. The stories reached the tribes to the west and north within weeks. Small delegations arrived, 2 or 3 warriors from each group approaching the gate with empty hands and cautious steps. Darok received them with the dignity of a chief who finally had something worth showing. He walked them through the settlement, pointing at the forge and the grain fields and the pottery workshop and the tanning station with the pride of a father showing off his children. Hyun-soo watched these visits from a distance and calculated. Each visiting group represented potential growth. More people meant more labor, meant more progress, meant more points. But more people also meant more mouths and more complexity and more chances for conflict. He needed infrastructure to handle expansion. He opened the catalog. Administrative tools section. Basic census and resource tracking system, 100 points. A scroll showing how to record population and food stores using tally marks on clay tablets. He bought it and taught it to Torak. The former prisoner had become indispensable. His counting skills had advanced to basic arithmetic, and he had a memory like a steel trap. He could track how many tubers were harvested, and how many mouths needed feeding, and how many days of food remained in storage. He became the settlement's first accountant, a position that had never existed in this world, and now could not be done without. The system rewarded the organizational advancement, 300 points. Balance climbed to 2,600. 3 new tribes sent formal delegations over the following weeks. The Broken Tusk from the northwest. 15 people led by a woman chief named Sarah, who carried twin obsidian daggers and spoke with the authority of someone who had killed to earn her position. The Marshwalkers from the east. 20 people who lived near the wetlands and knew more about fishing and water plants than anyone in the settlement. And the Bone Singers from the north. A strange, quiet group of 12 who decorated themselves with carved bone instruments that produced haunting sounds when the wind blew through them. Each group wanted the same thing: access to the miracle, protection behind the walls, food from the ground that grew on command. Hyun-soo negotiated through Darok. The terms were simple: join the settlement, follow the rules, work the fields, learn the crafts, share what you know, keep what you earn. No tribe rules over another. All eat, all build, all defend. Sarah of the Broken Tusk argued for 3 days. She was not accustomed to following anyone, and the idea of placing her people under a shared authority rankled her pride. Hyun-soo solved it not with force, but with an offer. He bought a set of advanced hunting trap designs for 80 points and presented them to Sarah personally. Her eyes lit up. She was a hunter to her core, and these designs represented techniques she had never imagined. She accepted the terms that evening. The Marshwalkers brought something Hyun-soo had not expected: knowledge he did not need to buy. Their leader, a weathered old man named Jarrell, showed the settlement how to weave fish traps from river reeds, how to smoke fish over slow coals for preservation, how to identify edible water plants that grew in the shallows upstream. Free technology, earned through millennia of survival in a different environment. Hyun-soo added it to the settlement's growing base without spending a single point. The system still rewarded the integration. Cross-tribal knowledge exchange. Cultural synthesis achieved. Reward 400 points. The Bone Singers were the most mysterious addition. They did not farm. They did not fight. They sang. Or rather, they produced sounds through their bone instruments that served as communication across distances. A low tone meant danger. A high, rapid series meant gathering. A sustained note meant peace. They had been using sound as language long before anyone in this world had thought to scratch marks on clay. Hyun-soo recognized what they were immediately: a communication network. He bought a set of signal drums for 60 points and combined them with the Bone Singer's existing sound system. Within a week, the settlement had a functioning alert network that could relay messages across the entire perimeter and beyond. The system approved. Communication infrastructure established. Reward 250 points. Balance after all purchases and rewards sat at 3,110. The settlement's population had swelled to 120. 5 tribes living inside expanding walls. Farming and fishing and forging and healing and counting and communicating. It was not a tribe anymore. It was a town. And towns attract attention from things larger than wandering hunters and curious traders. The attention came from the south. A runner arrived at the gate one morning, gasping and wild-eyed. He was not from the settlement. He was from a tribe further south that Hyun-soo had never contacted. The runner fell to his knees in front of Darok and spoke in a flood of terrified words. Darok's face went pale. He turned to Hyun-soo, and for the first time since they had met, the old chief looked afraid. The runner's message was about Korgu. The name meant nothing to Hyun-soo, but it meant everything to Darok and Burin and Sarah and every tribal leader in the settlement. Korgu was the high shaman of the southern plains. He commanded not one tribe, but a confederation of 5, held together by fear and superstition, and Korgu's claim that he spoke directly to the spirits. His word was divine law. His rituals involved blood and fire and the bones of enemies displayed on poles. And he had heard about the god of the walled village, who pulled miracles from the air. Korgu had declared Hyun-soo a demon, a false spirit sent to corrupt the natural order, and he was marching north with the combined warriors of his confederation. Not 60 fighters like the Red Fang raid, 300. 300 warriors. Hyun-soo sat by the forge and let the number settle in his mind. He had 120 people total, maybe 45 capable fighters if he counted every man and woman who could hold a spear. The math was brutal, nearly 7 to 1. The palisade and trenches had worked against 60. Against 300, they would be overwhelmed in hours. Attackers would simply flow around the walls and hit from every direction at once. He needed a different strategy. He opened the system and scrolled through the catalog with methodical calm. Panic was a luxury he had never been able to afford. Not in procurement, and not now. He had 3,110 points, the largest budget he had ever held. Time to spend it like it mattered. First purchase, advanced fortification materials. Cut stone blocks, 200 units, 400 points. The blocks appeared in neat stacks outside the walls. Darok's eyes went wide, but Hyun-soo was already pointing and directing. Stone walls, real walls. Not lashed logs, but fitted stone rising to chest height with wooden palisade on top. The entire settlement mobilized. Every hand carried stone. Krom designed interlocking patterns based on the Forge Guide's illustrations of stone-lined pits. He scaled the concept up, and it worked. Within 3 days, the southern wall was reinforced with stone to a height that no charging warrior could vault over. Second purchase, arrows. 500 shafts with bronze tips, 600 points. Krom's forge had been producing bronze steadily, but not fast enough for a war. The purchased arrows filled the gap. Krom now had 12 trained archers and enough ammunition to make every shot count. He drilled them on the wall morning and evening until their arms shook and their fingers bled. Third purchase, medical supplies. Advanced wound treatment kit, 300 points. Mago received it with grim efficiency. She had seen what battle wounds looked like after the Red Fang fight. She organized her 3 apprentices into a field hospital behind the walls and prepared bandages and poultices and bone splints in quantities that made Hyun-soo's stomach turn. She was preparing for mass casualties. She was right to. Fourth purchase. Something Hyun-soo had been considering for weeks. A detailed tactical manual covering defensive warfare, 200 points. Not Stone Age tactics, real military theory, choke points, fields of fire, reserve deployment, morale management, psychological warfare. He studied it himself for an entire night by the light of the forge. Then he taught what he could to Darok and Sarah. The woman chief absorbed the tactical concepts faster than anyone. Her hunter's mind translated ambush techniques into military strategy with frightening ease. She redesigned the flanking positions on her own, and Hyun-soo approved every change. Total spent 1,500 points. Balance 1,610. He kept the reserve for emergencies. The scouts reported Korgu's army moving steadily north. 2 days away, then 1, then hours. Hyun-soo used the remaining time for something that had nothing to do with walls or weapons. He gathered the settlement. All 120 people standing in the open area between the grain fields and the forge. Warriors and farmers and healers and children and former prisoners. He stood on a flat stone so they could see him, and he spoke through Darok, who translated. He told them that an army was coming, that it was larger than anything they had faced, that the shaman who led it called him a demon and wanted to destroy everything they had built. He told them what they had built. He pointed at the walls they had raised with their own hands, the fields they had planted and harvested, the forge where metal was born from fire and stone, the shelters where their children slept warm and fed. 3 months ago, they had been scattered, starving bands, running from predators and starvation. Now they were a town. He told them he was not a god. He paused and let Darok translate that part. Silence fell over the crowd. Darok stopped mid-sentence and stared at Hyun-soo. Nari stepped forward from the crowd, the shaman's daughter, who had been watching Hyun-soo with careful eyes since the day he arrived. She had never spoken to him directly. She had observed and listened and helped where she could and said nothing about what she had seen. Now she spoke. Her voice was clear and steady and carried across the silent crowd. Darok translated her words. She said that she had known for a long time that Hyun-soo was not a god. She had seen him struggle and sweat and bleed. She had seen the light in his eyes when he spoke to his invisible window. She had watched him count and worry and sit alone in the dark with the weight of decisions no god would need to make. She said he was a man who had been given a gift and chosen to share it instead of hoarding it. And that a man who builds walls for strangers and heals enemies and teaches prisoners to count is worth following whether he is divine or not. The silence stretched. Then Darok thumped his fist against his chest. The sound was like a drumbeat. Sarah did the same. Then Krom. Then Garun. Then Torak, the former prisoner, who had learned to count to 1,000. Then Mago, who had never once called Hyun-soo a god to his face. One by one, fist against chest. The sound built until 120 people were beating their chests in unison, and the rhythm rolled across the settlement like thunder. Hyun-soo stood on his stone and felt something crack inside his chest. Not pain, the opposite. The thing he had been carrying since the day he arrived. The fear that when they learned the truth, they would turn on him. It broke apart and fell away, and left something warm and solid in its place. He raised his fist and brought it to his own chest. One beat. The crowd roared. Korgu's army arrived on a gray morning with clouds pressing low against the earth. They came from the south in a column that stretched across the grassland like a dark river. 300 warriors painted in ash and blood. Animal skulls mounted on poles swayed above the ranks. Drums pounded a cadence that shook the ground under Hyun-soo's feet as he stood on the stone wall and watched them approach. At the head of the column walked a figure draped in a cloak of black feathers. Korgu. Even at a distance, Hyun-soo could sense the man's presence. He moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had spent decades convincing others that his every step was guided by spirits. 2 massive warriors flanked him, carrying clubs studded with obsidian shards, his personal guard. The army halted 200 paces from the walls. Korgu stepped forward alone. He raised a staff topped with a skull and feathers, and he spoke. His voice was powerful, trained. It carried across the distance without effort, and though Hyun-soo could not understand every word, the meaning was clear. This was a pronouncement, a declaration from the spirits through their chosen vessel. He was telling his warriors and anyone behind these walls that the demon inside must be destroyed. That the unnatural things growing from the ground and the strange walls of stone were corruption. That the natural order demanded blood. Darok translated in a low voice beside Hyun-soo. Korgu says the spirits reject you. He says everything you have built is an abomination. He says his warriors will tear down the walls and burn the fields and scatter the bones of everyone inside. Hyun-soo watched Korgu perform, because that is what it was, a performance. The dramatic cloak, the skull staff, the practiced voice. Hyun-soo had sat through hundreds of supplier presentations in his career. He recognized theater when he saw it. Korgu was selling fear, and his customers were buying because they had never been offered an alternative. Hyun-soo turned to Darok. He asked the chief to shout back a message. Darok hesitated. Then he climbed onto the wall and bellowed across the field. He told Korgu that the people behind these walls did not fear spirits because they had learned to grow food and forge metal and heal the sick. He told him that the man Korgu called a demon had saved starving tribes and healed enemy wounded and taught prisoners to count. He told him that Korgu's spirits had never fed a single hungry child. Korgu's face contorted. He slammed his staff into the ground and screamed a command. The drums roared. 300 warriors surged forward. The first wave hit the trench system that Hyun-soo had expanded since the Red Fang battle. Deeper now and lined with sharpened stakes and covered in places with thin mats of grass that collapsed under weight. Warriors fell screaming into the pits. The charge fragmented as men tried to avoid the traps and funneled toward the gaps that Hyun-soo had left open on purpose. Kill zones. Krom's archers opened fire. 12 bows with bronze-tipped arrows releasing in coordinated volleys. The first rank of attackers crumpled. Arrows punched through hide shields that had never been tested against metal points. The bronze tips cut through leather and flesh with terrifying efficiency. Warriors who had survived a lifetime of Stone Age combat dropped without understanding what had hit them. But 300 is 300. The second wave came over the bodies of the first. They hit the stone walls and tried to climb. Darok's spearmen met them at the top. Bronze spear points against obsidian. The clang of metal on stone rang across the battlefield as attackers tried to hook the wall edge with their weapons and pull themselves up. Sarah led the western flank defense with savage precision. She had positioned her broken tusk fighters at the corners where two walls met, creating overlapping fields of attack. Warriors who tried to round the corner were hit from two directions at once. The tactical manual was paying for itself. Korgu watched the carnage from his position behind the lines. Hyun-soo could see the shaman's expression shifting. This was not what he had expected. Walls that resisted charging, arrows that pierced shields, defenders who fought in coordinated groups instead of individual combat. His numerical advantage was being neutralized by technology and tactics. The shaman changed strategy. He sent a group of 40 warriors around the settlement to hit the north wall where the defenses were thinnest. Hyun-soo had anticipated this. Torak was waiting there with 20 defenders and a surprise. Hyun-soo had spent 200 points from his reserve on something specific. Clay pots filled with Mago's tree resin mixed with charcoal. Crude incendiary devices. When the 40 warriors reached the north wall and began climbing, Torak's group lit the pots and hurled them down. The pots shattered on impact, and burning resin splashed across the attackers. Screams erupted. Men rolled on the ground, trying to extinguish flames that clung to skin and clothing. The North assault collapsed in minutes. The system pulsed. Innovative defensive technology deployed. Reward, 300 points. The battle raged for hours. Wave after wave struck the walls and broke. Krom's archers ran through their arrows and switched to throwing stones from the wall top. Darok took a deep cut across his forearm and kept fighting with blood running down his spear shaft. Two defenders fell from the wall with serious injuries, and Mago's team dragged them to the field hospital and went to work. By midday, the ground around the settlement was littered with wounded and dead. Korgu had lost over 80 warriors. The remainder pulled back out of arrow range and milled in confused groups. The drums had stopped. Korgu himself stood motionless, staring at the walls. His feathered cloak was spattered with mud. His skull staff hung at his side. For the first time in decades, the man who claimed to speak for spirits had nothing to say. Hyun-soo opened the system. Balance 1,710 after the battle rewards. He made one final purchase. Not a weapon, a white cloth banner. 5 points. He climbed to the top of the wall and held it up. A signal of parley, universal enough that even Stone Age warriors understood a man standing exposed and unarmed above a battlefield. Korgu stared at the banner. Minutes passed. Then the shaman walked forward, alone. He stopped at the edge of the trench and looked up at Hyun-soo standing on the wall above him. The two men regarded each other across the gap between their worlds. The shaman who ruled by fear and the procurement manager who built with investment. Korgu's voice was a rasp when he spoke. The power and theater were gone. He was a 50-year-old man standing in mud, surrounded by his dead and defeated warriors, looking up at a wall that should not exist. He spoke, and Darok translated from beside Hyun-soo. Korgu said he would accept death if it came, that a shaman who could not protect his people deserved the spirit's judgment. He said to strike him down and be done with it. Hyun-soo looked at the old shaman for a long moment. Then he sat down on the wall edge and dangled his legs over the side. Casual, unthreatening. He told Darok to translate carefully. He told Korgu that he did not kill defeated enemies. He told him that 8 Red Fang prisoners lived in the settlement. They ate the same food and slept under the same roofs, and one of them had just commanded the defense of the North Wall. He told Korgu that his people were starving the same way Greystone had been starving 3 months ago. That the spirits Korgu claimed to serve had never grown a single crop or healed a single wound or built a single wall. And that the real question was not whether Korgu would die today, but whether his people would eat tomorrow. Korgu listened without moving. His eyes were dark and unreadable. Hyun-soo continued. He said that behind these walls, there was enough knowledge to feed every tribe on the southern plains. Farming, medicine, metal, clean water, all of it available to anyone willing to work and learn, and stop killing their neighbors over territory that could feed 10 times more people if someone just planted seeds in it. He said Korgu had 2 choices: walk away with his surviving warriors and return to a life of blood and hunger and slow decline, or bring his people inside the walls and let them learn what every other tribe here had learned, that a full stomach is worth more than a skull on a pole. Korgu was silent for a long time. The wind blew across the battlefield, carrying the smell of smoke and blood. Behind him, his remaining warriors watched with hollow eyes. They had come here expecting an easy slaughter and found something that defied everything they knew about the world. Their shaman's magic had failed against walls that did not break and arrows that cut through shields. Korgu asked one question. Darok translated it quietly. He asks what you are. If not a god and not a demon, then what? Hyun-soo almost laughed. He told Korgu exactly what he was. A man who used to buy things for a company in a world that no longer existed. A man who had been given a catalog of tools and decided to share them instead of using them to conquer. A man who was very tired and whose back hurt from sleeping on the ground for 3 months and who desperately missed coffee. Korgu did not understand the word coffee, but he understood the rest. The shaman looked at his hands, the hands that had wielded a skull staff and performed rituals of blood and commanded through fear for 30 years. Then he laid his staff on the ground at the foot of a wall. The skull and feathers settled into the mud. He straightened and looked up at Hyun-soo. He did not kneel. He did not bow. He stood as an equal, a man addressing a man. And he said one word that Darok translated with something close to wonder in his voice. Teach. The system erupted. The notification was the largest Hyun-soo had ever seen. Coalition dissolved. Enemy confederation integrated through diplomacy. 5 tribes unified under shared governance. Reward 50,000 points. Hyun-soo stared at the number. 50,000 points. His vision blurred, and he realized his eyes were wet. He wiped them with the back of his hand and climbed down from the wall. The gate opened. Korgu walked through. Behind him, 220 surviving warriors lowered their weapons and followed their shaman into a settlement that had been trying to kill them an hour ago. Mago was already moving. She directed her healers toward the wounded on both sides without distinction. Krom's archers came down from the walls and began helping carry injured attackers to the field hospital. Torak organized water distribution with the efficiency of a man born to logistics. Nari appeared beside Hyun-soo. She had been at the hospital during the battle, treating wounds with steady hands and a calm that belied her age. She looked at the stream of former enemies flowing through the gate and then at Hyun-soo. She did not say anything. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were still stained with dried blood from the surgery she had been performing. His were covered in dirt and splinters from the wall. They stood together and watched as the settlement doubled in size in a single afternoon. 340 people behind walls of stone, fields of grain waving in the wind, a forge burning bright, healers working, counters tallying, builders planning. The first town in the history of Garun. Hyun-soo squeezed Nari's hand. The blue window glowed softly at the edge of his vision. Balance, 51,710 points. And for the first time since he had arrived in this world, he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel. Hope. Not the desperate hope of a man trying to survive until tomorrow. The quiet, steady hope of someone who could see far enough ahead to believe that tomorrow might actually be worth reaching. 6 months had passed since Hyun-soo fell from the sky in a torn office shirt with 500 points and a prayer. The town had a name now. Not Greystone. That was too small for what it had become. They called it Arun. Nari had suggested it, a shortening of Garun that meant first light in the old tongue. 340 people had become 500 as word spread across the plains and mountains that there was a place where no one starved and no one was turned away. Arun had streets, actual streets of packed earth running between rows of stone and timber buildings. A central square with the forge on one side and the granary on the other, and the hospital on the third. The fourth side was open, facing the grain fields that stretched south in golden rows that would have made any modern farmer weep with recognition. Krom had become the master smith. His forge produced bronze tools and weapons in steady supply. Plows, axes, knives, arrow points. He had trained 6 apprentices and was experimenting with iron smelting, using techniques from an advanced metallurgy guide that Hyun-soo had purchased for 500 points. The first iron blade was ugly and pitted, but it held an edge twice as long as bronze. Krom held it up, and his eyes burned with the fire of a man who had found his purpose in a world that had not known it existed. Torak ran the administration. The former prisoner had developed the tally system into a full accounting method, using clay tablets and a base 10 number system that Hyun-soo had taught him. He tracked food stores and population and building materials and trade goods with an obsessive precision that would have earned him a corner office in any modern corporation. He had also begun teaching others to count and record. 20 students attended his daily sessions, sitting in the dirt with clay tablets on their knees, scratching numbers with bone styluses. Sarah commanded the defense force. 60 trained warriors with bronze weapons, organized into squads of 10 with designated leaders and coordinated tactics. She had taken the tactical manual and rewritten it through practice into something suited for this world. Her warriors drilled every morning. They were not an army by modern standards, but by the standards of Garun, they were an unstoppable force. No tribe within 100 kilometers would challenge Arun's walls. Mago had retired from active healing. Her apprentices ran the hospital now. 12 trained healers serving a population that had the lowest mortality rate in the history of the world. Mago spent her days in a small stone building near the hospital, cataloging every plant she had identified and every treatment she had developed. Her system of colored marks on flat stones had evolved into something approaching a written pharmacological reference. She was creating a medical textbook in a world that had not yet invented the alphabet. Darok was still the chief, older now and slower, but no less fierce when needed. He had adapted to a role he could never have imagined, not just a warrior leader, but a governor. A man who settled disputes between 5 different tribal groups and allocated resources and planned expansions, and listened to Torak's reports with the focused attention of someone who understood that numbers mattered, even if he could not read them himself. Korgu was the surprise. The old shaman had not simply submitted, he had transformed. Stripped of his mystical authority, he had revealed something underneath the performance: intelligence. A deep, shrewd understanding of people and their motivations. Hyun-soo had made him the settlement's diplomat. The man who had once commanded through fear now negotiated trade agreements with distant tribes, using charm and strategy and the undeniable evidence that Arun's way of life produced results. He was good at it, frighteningly good. Nari was everything. She had become the bridge between Hyun-soo's knowledge and the town's capacity to absorb it. She learned faster than anyone he had ever met. Reading, mathematics, basic science, agricultural theory. She translated his ideas into language and methods that the people of Arun could understand and implement without needing a man from the future to hold their hands. She was also the person who made sure Hyun-soo ate when he forgot, slept when he pushed too hard, talked when the weight of responsibility made him go quiet. She had never worshipped him. She had seen him clearly from the first day. A tired, complicated man doing something extraordinary not because he was special, but because he refused to stop. On a cool evening 6 months after his arrival, Hyun-soo walked beyond the walls for the first time in weeks. Nari walked beside him. They followed the stream east, away from the fields and the forge smoke and the constant sounds of construction. The grassland was quiet. The sun sat low on the horizon, painting the clouds in orange and gold. He stopped at a rocky outcrop overlooking a small valley. Below, the stream wound through a grove of trees and disappeared into the distance. The world stretched out before them, vast and wild and unchanged for 10,000 years in every direction, except the one small point of light behind them, where 500 people were building something that had never existed. Nari pointed at something on the rocks. Hyun-soo looked down, and his breath stopped. Carved into the stone surface were marks, not natural erosion, deliberate marks, lines and curves arranged in patterns that were unmistakably intentional. And beside them, a symbol that made Hyun-soo's blood run cold. A small rectangle with lines of text inside it, crude but recognizable. Someone had carved a picture of the system window into stone. He knelt and ran his fingers over the carving. It was old, very old. The edges were weathered, and lichen had grown into the grooves. Decades old at minimum, maybe centuries. Someone had been here before him. Someone with the same system. The same floating catalog. The same impossible gift dropped into a primitive world. He looked closer. Below the system carving were more marks. A sequence that could have been numbers. A series of tally marks grouped in clusters. And at the bottom, a single image carved deeper than the rest. A figure standing on a hill with arms raised toward the sky. And above the figure, a shape that was not the sun or the moon or any natural thing. A circle with lines radiating from it in a pattern that suggested something mechanical, something designed. The system window pulsed at the edge of his vision. A new notification appeared, one he had never seen before. Discovery detected. Remnant of previous procurement system user located. Historical data fragment recovered. Initiating contextual download. Information flooded his mind. Not words, images, flashes of memory that were not his own. A woman in strange clothing standing in a field of wheat. A man hammering metal in a primitive forge. A child drawing numbers in dirt. And behind all of them, the same blue window floating in the air. Then one final image. A vast structure. Not a building, something larger. Something that existed outside of Garun. Outside of time as he understood it. A place where screens floated in rows by the thousands, each one showing a different world, a different era. A different person standing confused and terrified in a landscape that was not their own, each one with a system, each one being watched. The download ended. Hyun-soo sat back on the rocks and stared at the sky. His hands were trembling. The system was not a gift. It was a test. Garun was not a random world. It was a laboratory. And he was not the first subject. He was one of hundreds, maybe thousands, sent across time and space to primitive worlds and given the tools to build civilization from nothing. Some had succeeded. The woman who brought wheat, the man who brought metal. Their contributions had survived them. Others had failed. Their ruins lay scattered across Garun as warnings. The system did not care about him. It cared about results, progress, development metrics measured in points and population growth and technological advancement. He was being evaluated, graded, scored. And the final question remained unanswered. What happened to those who passed the test? And what happened to those who failed? Nari watched his face. She could not see the system window, but she could see the change in his expression. She sat beside him on the rock and waited. She had learned that when Hyun-soo went quiet, something important was happening behind his eyes. He looked at her. Then he looked back at the town glowing warm in the fading light. 500 people who had been dying 6 months ago were now building a civilization because a procurement manager from Seoul had decided to invest in seed corn instead of snack packs. He did not have all the answers. He did not know who was watching or why or what came next. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever test this was, he was not going to fail it by hoarding points and playing it safe. He was going to fail it or pass it the same way he had done everything since he arrived, by finding the right product for the right need at the right time and trusting that the people he served would do the rest. The system window pulsed. Balance 51,710 points. Catalog available. New categories unlocked. He smiled. Then he opened the catalog and started shopping.